Let me begin by introducing myself, Robert Cottrell, and the panel that we have for this discussion in the order in which I'm going to ask them to speak. We have Kristi Raik, who is a researcher from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. We have Ivars Iabs, a professor at the University of Latvia. We have Tim King from Brussels, the editor of the weekly newspaper European Voice. And we have Roberts Kylis, who most of you will know best as the recent education minister. And to frame the discussion, we've had a debate earlier on this afternoon about the outlook for the European Union. Is it just me, or is there a musical box in the room? It's rather lovely anyway, so I'm not going to get fussed. And happily for our sponsors, the European Commission, I think we decided that the European Union was not, in fact, doomed, or possibly that it was doomed to succeed. But anyway, we had the debate, and it was brilliant. I mean, if you weren't here for it, I do recommend trying to catch it on the web archive. And that was fun. And what we've got now is something which is more like work. I think of this as a working session. We're not going to argue about the causes of the crisis, or still less about the economics or the mechanics of the common currency. It's not a technical discussion. It's really a question of what we have learnt from the experience of the crisis. And I think the object is to collect an inventory of lessons which can help us to understand better what it is that we've lived through and what value we can extract from it to carry forward. I mean, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, in Rahm Emanuel's phrase, so let us put this one to some educational use, even if it is the most expensive education in history, probably. So I think the sort of things we want to think about are whether we have more or less confidence in the European Union based on what we've seen of its performance in times of crisis. We want to talk about what we've learned about our own national interests and how those have collided with one another or accommodated one another in times of crisis, what we're discovering about the new balance of power in the European Union, and particularly the dominant role which seems to be inescapably that of Germany. I'm curious about whether the European institutions have had a learning experience, and I think looking forward, there's a question of whether greater enlargement of the European Union is feasible, desirable, or whether the current crisis has taught us some hesitation or caution on that score. So those are the sort of things that I think we ought to be talking about much more than financial projects. So, Kristi, if you would like to begin. And I suspect it would be good if we were to talk individually for 5 or 10 minutes initially. Then I hope very much that there will be contributions, lessons from everybody here. If you would like to interrupt a speaker while he or she is speaking, then please do stand, make your intention clear, and it will be the speaker to decide whether to give way, and otherwise we'll have opening remarks and then discussion. Kristi.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be part of this panel. I wish I had the same enthusiasm and drive as the young speakers we just heard, but I will try my best, and I will offer you some random observations from the north. I work in the Finnish think tank, foreign policy think tank. I'm Estonian. I've spent most of my adult life in Helsinki and in Brussels, so perhaps I can safely say that I have a mixed European view on things going on in Europe. And some things we have learned from the euro crisis, and some things I will argue we have maybe not yet learned, or not yet enough. But I will start by taking a look at Finland. And one of the lessons from a Finnish perspective is that solidarity in the EU is fragile. But nevertheless, I would say there is still a sense that we are in the same boat. And it has strengthened, it has not disappeared. Well, comparing Finland to Germany, the Germans, for one, seem to be painfully aware that they are in the same boat with Europeans, and this was proved by the re-election of Angela Merkel. Finland is a bit more tricky case, and last year, following Finland's pretty tough positions on the Eurozone bailouts, there were widespread speculations in the European media, in the Finnish media, about Finland planning to leave the Eurozone. Today, those speculations have been largely left behind, and the True Finns party, which suddenly became one of the most popular parties in Finland in the 2011 parliamentary elections, is actually not arguing that Finland should step out from the EU or the Eurozone. And Finland traditionally is a country of consensus politics, and I would say the True Finns have become somehow accommodated to this tradition of consensus politics. And they are having an eye on becoming a member of the government after the next parliamentary elections. And they know that this will not happen if they have very radical views. So this tradition of consensus politics is continuing. It has survived the crisis. And Finnish EU policy shows continuity rather than change. And yet, what I was following with quite an unease over the past years was the amount of Greece bashing in Finland. It was a favorite sport of Finns a couple of years ago. This popular anger over those lazy Southerners who just expect the hardworking Finns to pay for their irresponsible behavior. But I think more recently this anger has become mixed with some empathy. There is a huge amount of human suffering and social distress in the crisis countries, and this has been more widely reported in the media. But one thing that changes the Finnish perspective more than anything else is fresh figures about the Finnish economy. Finland is known as one of the most healthy economies in Europe, but the trends are actually quite worrying. The industrial production in the Eurozone has started to show signs of recovery. But in Finland, Finland is at the bottom among EU countries with an almost 6% drop over the past year. And there is a deep worry about decrease of competitiveness in Finland, among the Finnish industries in particular. Finland has been compared to Italy in this respect, but I hope Italians are not offended. So the Finnish government is ringing the alarm bells, and it's warning about painful structural reforms ahead, and it remains to be seen whether it will be actually able to implement these reforms. So it's good to take a bit longer historical perspective. 20 years ago, Finland was a country in a deep economic crisis on the verge of collapse. In recent years, it has been one of the model pupils in Europe, but the picture may change again, and you never know. Maybe in a few years' time, the Southern Europeans will have been through very tough reforms themselves and will be then pointing their fingers at the Nordic countries that are incapable of reforming their welfare systems that are overly expensive and that are unsustainable. And if you allow me a few more minutes, I would also like to jump to foreign policy, which is my actual field of expertise. I came to Riga to speak about the Eastern Partnership this morning. There was another event. And I would say the crisis has really changed the self-perception of Europe as an international player. And there is this understanding that perhaps Europe needs more humility, and its model power, its attraction, it has weakened. And we need to become more interested in how the emerging powers see the world, how they see their relationship with Europe. But in spite of all this talk about the emerging powers and Europe losing its relative weight, so far I don't see the other powers presenting competing visions for a different kind of world order. That is not there. So in a sense, Europe still is in a good position to have a say in the kind of global system that we have. But this system has to be redesigned in order to accommodate the rise of the non-Western powers. And if Europe is capable of doing that, it might have a chance to have still a very strong voice and strong position. But what is essential here is unity of Europe. And I would say in principle, this is something that European politicians are aware about. That if Europe wants to have a say in world affairs, it needs to be united. But in practice, it doesn't quite look like that. And one thing that has happened to foreign policies of EU member states over the past few years, we have done a study looking at that, is a considerable rise of commercial diplomacy, trade promotion. Foreign policy of European countries nowadays is increasingly about trade promotion. And there the Europeans are competing amongst each other for the best trade deals. And this is really undermining European unity and making it more difficult to have a common voice and to have even a common trade policy, which is supposedly at the heart of the EU's external action. So I think this is something that Europeans are just learning to adjust to, how the position of Europe in the world is changing and how to respond to that. And it's not enough to kind of just place trade promotion at the center of foreign policy and then hope that that will help us come out of the crisis. I will stop here.
One word I'm going to take away from that is humility. That what we have learned is that the European Union cannot simply presume that size and wealth will translate into a strategic presence with the United States here in New York. Here, but it's time to work harder on building strategies and alliances in a more complicated world. I'm sorry. Now, one thing which is impossible to avoid is that Latvia is about to join the euro on January the 1st. Can it possibly be that the main lesson of the euro crisis is that this is a good time to join the euro?
First, thanks for having me here. I mean, Latvia is a little bit of an outlier in the sense that I don't think that's a typical European country, and this actually shows how different Europe itself is, because reasons why Latvians are accessing the Eurozone are very hard to understand for many Western Europeans. I have been asked by many Western European journalists, why do you do that right now? Is this the most appropriate time? And so on and so forth. But from this point of view, this is not the main lesson of the Euro crisis, without any doubt. The first lesson, which is, in my opinion, just, let's say, self-evident, is that the Eurozone itself, as a politically motivated project, an elite project, is very hard to sustain, just because it's very hard to have a monetary union without more or less appropriate political superstructure. And this is, in my opinion, self-evident. What we are having right now is that we are trying somehow to rebuild the ship at the sea, try to deal with the crisis somehow, and we, to some extent, have succeeded in that. And from that point of view, I think that the Europe itself and the European Union has gone through very hard decisions, let's say, about the fiscal compact, about the possible banking union next year, and so on and so forth. What about the Latvian case? As I said, it's more or less atypical because of many different reasons. First, Latvian politics are very securitized, in the sense that most questions, including our membership in the Eurozone, are considered not from the point of view of economic viability, but from the point of view of national security. And this you might like or might not like it, but it's still, this is a kind of a priori of Latvian politics, and that's why we tried to access the Eurozone. The second issue is, of course, also the very weak political class, which is very fond of delegating different kinds of things to Brussels or to Washington, D.C. or to Frankfurt am Main and so on and so forth. And from this point of view, of course, you can understand also this so-called success story of Latvia with this internal devaluation and so on and so forth. Latvia, as you probably know, is right now a kind of a poster child for this kind of austerity measures and so on and so forth, and that's why Angela Merkel likes us very much. But on the other hand, of course, this success story is, in my opinion, connected with a couple of lessons, but I'm not sure whether this is very good that we have to have this kind of lessons. And one of these lessons is that, of course, you can introduce such harsh kind of austerity measures, but at the same time you have to be prepared to lose about a tenth of your population, which is still the case in Latvia starting from 2007. And from this point of view, I think there is some Latvian lesson, but I'm not very convinced that this Latvian lesson has been some kind of very productive, because I think it's not good for Latvia that we have to make this kind of lessons. On the European level, on the one hand, I would say that the best thing is that these worst scenarios have not been fulfilled. Greece and Cyprus are still in the Eurozone, and the Eurozone has not been split up, and some even want to join the EU right now. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, where really crucial decisions are being taken. Which means that European Union still has a lot of its soft power. However, of course, the political atmosphere itself has changed a lot. What we are seeing right now is a kind of mild renationalization of European politics. And this is not just because of some kind of elite split up, which is not the case, but rather there is a lot of popular demand for, let's say, looking to your own garden, looking to your own country. And that's what we are seeing just all over Europe. The British with this possible referendum in 2017. Austrians, where also this consensus about the European orientation of the country is becoming a little shaky. Hungarians, Germans with Alternative für Deutschland, which is also probably not the best sign on what's happening in Europe. On one hand, we might treat as a kind of a sign for, let's say, nationalism coming back to Europe and all these kind of pessimistic scenarios. But I'm not sure whether this is the right way to think about what's happening right now. Actually, this kind of renationalization, when people are trying to understand what's going on in their own countries and what's the meaning of the borders between these countries, it's probably not so a bad process, because European Union has, although there have been a lot of different kinds of cosmopolitan dreams made about the future of European Union, let's say with this constitutional treaty and so on and so forth, but European Union from the very beginning, it has been not as a kind of a super state, but rather as a legal framework for limited nationalism. And from this point of view, I think that Europe still has a future, but we have to dismiss these cosmopolitan dreams we had, let's say, until the economic crisis. And from this point of view, I would say that the lessons about, let's say, get rid of this wishful thinking have been made, and this is a positive tendency. And let me finish with the thesis that actually, in my opinion, the biggest challenge in a kind of a crash test for European Union is the democracy itself, because at the very beginning, the European Union has been an elite project which was let's say, founded not because of popular pressure, but very often against that popular pressure, with Adenauer and de Gaulle making that project, and so on and so forth. What we are seeing right now is democracy coming back, and coming back is sometimes in not very Euro-optimistic forms. And from this point of view, of course, the next year is going to be crucial with the next European Parliament, with the next European Commission. So, but still I'm quite optimistic that Europe is capable of evolving itself, of developing itself, because we have already quite a long history behind us, and this history has always been rather problematic from the point of view of different kinds of situative issues and so on and so forth. But exactly this track dependency keeps us on this track just to go on, and even the most extreme Eurosceptics in Europe are not, let's say, not against the idea of European Union itself or European unification itself. Thank you.
Ivars, thank you. Now, again, if I could pull a point out which leaps out of that from me, which is that the conventional wisdom in Brussels was always that crises led to greater integration. But I think that the picture that you've given there is one of which, at least with the present fundamentals, we found that real crisis actually forces politics back to its national roots. Okay. Now, Tim, you're here from Brussels. You run the House newspaper, the European Voice. Has this crisis been a learning experience for the European institutions? Are they good at learning?
Swift response to being described as house newspaper is we're supposed to be outside the house. We're not necessarily domesticated. But it's perfectly true that I'm spending my time pressed up with my nose against the glass of whichever horrible architectural building it is, and actually therefore that I lack focus. And the nice thing about coming to Riga and listening to that debate where the earlier was, as you said, you said wisdom and judgment was provided by them, and that left the older generation to do what the hell we liked, I suppose. Okay, so that's sort of what I'm doing, but I'm admitting from the outset that I don't have the focal length. I'll tell you what I've learned, and I'll touch on what they haven't learned. One is, and it seems appropriate to say this in Riga, is that we've learnt that being a big country is better than being a small country. That if you're Cyprus would be the extreme example, or Greece, you'll probably get more unfavourable treatment than if you're Spain or Italy, because that's sheer self-interest. Because if you're Spain or Italy, you have the potential to bring the whole construct down. I'll just throw these things out quickly, and if anyone disagrees with them, they can stand up and actually be better if they stand up and walk out. The EU is sort of good at improvisation, but it doesn't have the tools for proper crisis management, so it has to improvise. So there's no choice about it. You can bring in the Isaiah Berlin version on that. And part of the reason they're improvising is, number 3 is, there is no rule book, or at least if there is a rule book, they're still writing it. And we saw that particularly when they're making things up about the haircut on Greece and on Cyprus when they decide to bring in the over-large investors. And then Mr. Dijsselbloem says that this is a model for the future, and then somebody kicks him under the table and he says, oh, no, maybe it isn't a model for the future. They're still making it up. So they are still learning themselves. I don't think that the crisis is over. It's a lull, and one can look at the situation in Italy last week or Slovenia next week or wherever the political crisis is that can come up and mess things up. And this goes back to the earlier point about the external situation outside the EU. We're not clear at all that the Eurozone has the ability in its current state to withstand external shocks. And given the state of the US and China, one wouldn't really want to be counting against external shocks. Another lesson, banks and politics don't mix. And Ireland and Spain were the extreme examples of entangling their banks with their politics and vice versa. Another lesson, we prefer our economic transfers to be invisible. Economic transfer is really at the heart of the European Union as part of the idealism, but we prefer it to be disguised. The moment it becomes explicit, that notion of other Finns bailing out those unworthy Greeks or the Germans or whatever it is, then people become politically uncomfortable about it. Actually, we learned on the subject of EU institutions that the Eurozone is more attached to the EU institutions than at one time seemed likely. They have not gone as far, perhaps, or as quickly in developing Eurozone institutions as it seemed at one point they might have done. And the Eurozone Council, that's to say, it's perfectly true that the European Council has taken power and influence away from the finance ministers, whether the Eurozone finance ministers or the EU finance ministers in a bigger group, but the Eurozone Council, the government leaders of the Eurozone, haven't wanted to undermine the European Council as a whole. Interesting question would be whether that would remain the case after Poland joined the Eurozone. On institutions, one should add that the German Constitutional Court is now a European Union institution with its own say on things. Ninth thing would be that the single market is an ideal more observed in the breach, and that goes back to your point about resorting to nationalisation. When we had the single market ideal was that you consolidated banks, they would cross-border consolidation, they would become bigger and bigger, and then they became too big to fail, and then they were on the point of failing, and the likes of Dexia and so on had to be divided up in emergency meetings between Benelux governments on a Sunday afternoon in Brussels. And that's a perfect example of how actually you had to retreat back to national, to carve out what's the Belgian bit of Fortis Bank was one of the examples. You could see the same situation with Swedish banks in the Nordic area and Austrian banks in Central Europe. And a 10th lesson, which is not mine, but it's my old history professor, and he had 2 rules of history, and I can't remember whether it's the first one or the second one, and I can't remember what the other one was. But the lesson I can remember is we are no wiser than our forebears. And I think the Eurozone crisis bears out that we are no wiser than our forebears, and we carry on making mistakes.
I don't know if John Gray is in the house, but I think he would certainly agree with that. Now, let me just bounce over to you the question that I pulled out of what Ivars was saying, which is, do you find people in Brussels still who are arguing that this is in some sense a constructive crisis, that the European Union will emerge stronger and better for it, or is there a sense that actually this has been globally destructive?
Well, the point that he made was that the Eurozone crisis was a crash test, to which the thought that flashed into my mind was, who are the dummies? and the dummies would appear to be the voters and the taxpayers of the Eurozone. So yes, they carry on. It goes back to that point about improvisation. Maybe they didn't. There's no control about this particular experiment. They've got one go at it, and they're rather messing it up.
Brilliant, Tim. Thank you. Roberts, you have some direct experience of being in government, and I guess that gives you a very special perspective, that outside government one tends to see the possibilities and the opportunities, and inside government one tends to feel the constraints. Has your experience of the crisis in any sense changed your view of Latvia in particular and the European Union in general, and of the ability of individual governments to advance their own interests with or against those of the European Union?
Thanks for having me here. Yes, it has. Do you need explanation?
Yes, very much.
Well, I joined the ranks when most of the cuts had been done already. Although some trades, or even many trades were made, for example, I traded funds for youth policy against 10 kilometers of road construction. So one experience one gets in being in the government is what impossible, unimaginable equations, calibrations can be made. So you can compare things which seem to be totally in different fields of metaphysics even. Right? So that's one thing you get as an experience. But there are some more serious experiences. And one thing I learned, which was surprising to me, was that you can recover, sorry for being provocative, without doing structural reforms. Or you could do some, but certainly not those that were expected to be done. And Latvia is one of the examples. So you can recover without doing serious, deep, fundamental changes. And recovery can be spectacular. Second, it is almost impossible to do changes without money. Well, that was kind of the mood or the genre we ministers needed to play at the end of 2012 and at the end of 2011 and 2012. We had to do some changes, but there was no money available, extra money available. And it is almost impossible to do changes. I mean, you have to have some money for doing changes. Even if you have an intellectual idea how to do it, it still doesn't work. Partly because stakeholders got the message that crisis is nearly over and started to avalanche their requests for delayed payments. So some or many stakeholders were under strain for 2 years, and then there was a message that the Latvian crisis is nearly over. Well, the Europeans have some sort of crisis, but Latvian, and then they started to come more and more with the increasing and escalating demands. I think another issue, what was learned or is still being learned, is why the hell we cannot loosen the belts? Why should we be patient for that damn troubled euro? Why? And this is a kind of general public's perspective. explanations that joining Eurozone would bring benefits to entrepreneurs or this or that particular sector are quite sophisticated for general public. So in a way, the pressures on ministries as well as ministers to loosen the belt and the need to not do that or explain why we are not doing that was extremely difficult intellectual work. I mean, almost impossible, because you couldn't compare again the benefits of joining Euro to understanding of what are important things in lives of people. A couple of other things which might not necessarily be bad. I think one of the visible signs of learning from not necessarily Euro crisis, but the crisis that was before, and Latvia had two crises of 1.5 at least, was that fiscal discipline law is now in place. It has been for 2 years in process, and it's now in place. So it's visible sign that something has been learned, namely that substantial debt is bad. Simple thing, but it was learned, and it has been learned. The other thing I again throw into public, which might not necessarily be sort of easy or comfortable, is that I think that crisis has shown that reckless behavior is still being awarded. We can talk about suffering of Greek people, sorry for being very cynical, but Greeks have had substantial debt being, signed off. Much more than Latvians borrowed. Whereas those who have been prudent before pay for the reckless behavior of some, especially if you are a significant player. So I guess it's not any kind of reckless behavior that has been awarded, but either smart or, well, I can't even find the word for that. There's another meaning of the motivations. Of course, that is something one needs to reflect on. What are the reasons to be prudent if you, in times of crisis or after that, will still have to pay for behavior of some reckless people or reckless parties. I mean, in game theory, it's called Little Pig, Big Pig game, where the outcome of the game is that the big pig presses a lever and runs, and the little pig waits where the food straw comes out, and simply waits, doesn't do anything. But the big pig runs back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So, this is called Nash equilibrium, because there's no strategy that is better than that. So in a way, crisis has shown that. And I would be a bit more cautious than the previous speakers in questioning still whether or not the euro crisis has questioned it, in itself, attractiveness and powerfulness of Europe as a model to follow. I guess there is some, or even serious problems with that. So I guess that the crisis has been sobering, or whatever, changing views on many parties to what extent they need or can or should follow the European example. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Now, this is the point at which comments and questions would be very, very welcome. I have got one or two of my own, so... and do we have microphones to go around? Yes, we do. Excellent. But I want to pick up on a remark of Robert's and put it over to Christy. Christy, when you look a lot at the partnership countries, the countries that are hoping to join the European Union. What do you think the spectacle of this crisis has taught them? What's it done to their ambitions and expectations? I mean, if they have studied it and have learnt the lesson that Robert suggests, which is that reckless behaviour is rewarded, then that's quite a worrying state of affairs. I mean, are they still as keen?
Well, looking at countries in the eastern neighborhood that have been willing and really keen to have a European perspective, to join the EU one day, and I'm speaking about Ukraine and Moldova in particular, and Georgia, they have not changed their position. So in that sense, regionally, the EU is still quite attractive, and it still is the major regional power, and I think it needs to be more aware of that and take more responsibility for developments in the neighborhood. But of course, the public perceptions of the EU in the neighboring countries have been affected by the crisis. It's just that there is no other viable, convincing alternative. If you look to the east, Russia is presenting its own model of integration, its plans for a Eurasian Union, which nobody exactly knows what it will be one day. But that is not an offer for modernization or reforms or some sort of development path for the neighboring countries. So in that sense, there is no decisive change in terms of the attractiveness of the EU in the eyes of neighbors. But it has become more difficult to convince them to do the reforms that the EU is asking them to do, or to see the EU as a model, to see the whole set of EU legislation, the whole set of EU norms as a model. That has lost credibility.
Which is a very worrying trend, isn't it, in that respect? I mean, Tim, from Brussels looking out, do you see any connection between the way that people think about this crisis and the way that people think about enlargement? I mean, obviously it's practically difficult to proceed with further enlargement when your resources are completely occupied by a financial crisis, but is there any political relationship between the processes?
I think for the countries that are well distant from European Union membership, the concern has been that the European Union will turn inwards, worry too much about its own domestic problems and the Eurozone's problems, and not pay any attention to devote time and attention and what little treasure remains to ushering in new member states. Though to be unusually topical for a journalist, what's on the front page of tomorrow's European Voice is about the reports that the Commission will produce next week about the candidate countries for enlargement, which will actually attempt to inject a bit of momentum into things for the Western Balkans. But what's disappeared in the meantime, utterly off the enlargement agenda, is Turkey and Iceland, and Iceland is very much a casualty of financial crisis.
Ivars, one thing that struck me as a recently arrived foreigner in Latvia at the onset of the crisis was the relative calm with which this terrible economic downturn was received. There was one evening a very mild unrest, and I think that was it. Now, you mentioned emigration as one valve for releasing the pressures that might otherwise be expressed on the street here. But did you find you learnt something about the nature of society here? Is there anything which surprised you or which confirmed your views about the willingness to accept hardship?
Let's say there are two possible answers. One is a politically correct answer, which is saying that this is bad. Latvia has an extremely weak civil society. People are capable of taking all these things without any protests, without mass demonstrations, strikes, and so on and so forth. But still, on the other hand, I would say that there is also a different way to look at it. And this is the question of patience. We know that patience can also be treated as a positive resource for any developing society. The question whether you can still be patient and wait when your turn comes, let's say in individually, socially, economically terms, or you have to get everything here on the spot. And from this point of view, in my opinion, the Latvians have still proved that they have this positive resource. It, of course, has also a lot of historical reasons, because this crisis, compared with what was going on here, let's say in the early 1990s, is relatively mild and not so harsh. And also, of course, this wall we were talking about, Robert, meaning the emigration. People were leaving and people are still leaving, which is, of course, let's say, a question about the sustainability of the Latvian economy in general. But still, I would say that this is not just as a weakness or some lacking social capital or, let's say, some authoritarian remnants and so on and so forth. No, this is also patience which can be explained also from the kind of rational point of view, and not just because of the weakness of civil society.
So you're saying that when Latvia takes over the presidency of the Council of Ministers, the Council of Ministers whose building is named after Justus Lipsius, it will be a happy reconciliation between the champions of contemporary neo-Stoicism and the classical version.
Yes, that might be. You might be too.
Okay.
Do we have anybody in the House who would like to speak up for the virtues of anger? Anybody who felt that, in a sense, the public opinion took too much lying down and might have pushed back at an earlier stage?
They'd like to, but they can't work themselves up enough to do so.
Right, that's now, Robert, I would like to...
There's a question.
Oh, do we have... Excellent, please, yes.
And I work in several non-government organizations here in Riga, but I grew up and... I work in several non-government organizations here in Riga, but I grew up in the West, and all my life I've spent in the West, basically. But what I've observed here in Riga for the last 10 years is the fact that people use their anger positively to build and to discuss their ideas how to structure things to change. They do it in small organizations, even groups of friends, but basically in the last 2 or 3 years, if we look at what's happening not only in Riga, but in the small towns around Latvia, it's a very constructive and very positive approach that we have to do it ourselves.
Yes, at the back there, please.
Yeah, so perhaps a very similar experience from Estonia. So I also work for an NGO in Tallinn, and while I feel like Estonia in a similar way has managed to cope quite easily and has very little unrest, and our government has been quite popular after their austerity measures, I feel like perhaps a lot of unmet protests have come from regional areas or areas outside of Tallinn and bigger cities where the economic crisis hit the hardest and that still haven't recovered. But the problem, or I guess the challenge with these people, is that they're probably a bit more disconnected from the political networks. Thus, the frustration that does build out or build up in these areas does not actually meet the state-level politics. And in Estonia, this took the form of Rahvakogu, or this sort of informal political discussion that was formed by the best or biggest NGOs in Estonia, but I'd say there is still a lot of frustration existing that will now go into local elections. But I do believe that the fact that people had not had the opportunity to speak up during the worst times, it is going to show during these elections, and it is definitely already showing as the migration rates have been increasing both in Estonia and Latvia, as we know. So the fact that we're not being so vocal in the national discussion means that we're just going to Norway, Sweden and everywhere else to work. And that's, I think, quite bad, to be honest, right?
Thank you.
So in a way, not having demonstrations is disengagement with local politics and society. And it's kind of really high price to pay for lessons, disengagement of citizens with their own country and with their own country's political and social structures. What I also thought, I mean, of course one can look in a, again, positive way, say, well, we have had in Latvia all the protests, but just in a very tiny scale. For example, we had Occupy Wall Street in 2010 with 10 tents, in front of the Cabinet of Ministers. It was Occupy Wall Street, very, the same sense, but it was very tiny, So, but anyway, the general point would be that countries react differently to the crisis. That's one thing. And secondly, even the chief economist of the IMF, Blanchard, together with Griffiths, describing Latvia's lessons, a couple of weeks ago published paper, actually admits that also lessons from Latvia's recovery cannot be transferred to other countries or are problematic to transfer to the other countries. So in a way, we can learn from a crisis, but so what? I mean, can others use them?
Christy, would you say there was any anger and we saw the true Finns from the outside, and we saw the desire not to see Finnish money spent unnecessarily on subsidising the Greek budget. But would you say that was that done in a mood of rational self-interest, or was it done in a mood of anger?
Well, maybe anger is a bit too strong word. I would rather say frustration, and frustration over lack of alternatives. The Finnish political elite used to have a very kind of united common view about Finland's place in Europe and Finnish EU policy. So there was a reaction against that establishment, political establishment. But I would also like to come back to this point of renationalization, and this is linked to this experience of citizens being feeling they don't have an ability to influence political decision making. In a way, renationalization is a response or a reaction to the sense that the EU is too far and is not connected to the citizens. But I'm not sure if it is a convincing response, if it is a solution. Because when you look at what has happened during the crisis, there has been a further transfer of powers from the national to the EU level, and especially in the field of national economic policies. And you have seen the European Council as the key decision maker, supported then gradually by the European Commission, getting a stronger role in implementing the decisions and having a surveillance over national economic policies. So power is increasingly in Brussels. So renationalization is not really the answer, it's not really the solution. And maybe 1 or 2 years ago, we would have been offered as one answer that the EU structures need to be reformed, but somehow that debate has been fading away recently. There is this sense that, well, maybe the crisis is now soon over and we don't need to get engaged with another difficult discussion about treaty reform and EU institutions, because that has always been so painful.
Yes, that's a very good point. In fact, it echoes exactly the one that Robert's made about how dangerous it is to declare your crisis over, because then everybody starts piling in with new demands. So I think whereas the strategy of the European Commission has been to declare the crisis nil from day one, they should actually have insisted that it was going to go on forever. Now, Tim, you said that you thought the one thing that had come out in very sharp relief from this crisis was that big countries were always going to get the better of small countries, and that's life. Is there anything that can be done to break that template? I mean, for example, is it just that that happens to be the pattern of leadership that we've had in recent years? I mean, if you had a small country with a brilliant leadership and a strong vision, would the structure of the European Union institutions allow that country to push back?
Gosh.
Could you be a Singapore in Europe?
Well, there was a time when I suppose the likes of Slovakia were pioneering flat tax. I seem to remember at some meeting of finance ministers a very long time ago. But the difficulty, I mean, I think the economic reality is that the Spains and the Italys are just too important to the rest, and that German banks had huge exposure to government bonds from Spain and Italy. So that's part of why the big economies will always matter. I think the disturbing new development, I sound more emotional about it when I say disturbing. I mean, fascinating for me to watch, but disturbing to the equilibrium is a situation where France is just diminishing in power almost by the day. The French economy becomes more and more of a basket case. Euroscepticism is growing in France. And what that results in is that Angela Merkel is left on her own. In a way, she was the stronger bit of that Merkozy, unnaturally joined beast. But there was at least some pretense at joining together. But now you have a situation where you'd have to go back probably as far as de Gaulle to find one person who had such preeminent, unchallenged power in the European Union. And that's a very weird situation. And that's not about big versus small, that's almost about one and the rest. And that's deeply unhealthy. Because I think that some of the small countries sort of accepted that they wouldn't get to boss the big countries around. There was a sort of acceptance that there was something like a Franco-German axis, but they relied on the Commission to be an honest broker sticking up for the small countries, and that's sort of gone by the wayside as Mr. Barroso picks up the coattails of Merkozy, and Mr. Van Rompuy has been a sort of behind-the-scenes fixer who's not going to lead the way and represent the smaller countries.
I mean, Ivars, you were saying that you saw the whole of the Latvian policy towards Europe and within Europe as rooted in national security. Is there any tension between that and a Europe which is increasingly led and dominated by one country, Germany, or is that in the price?
I think it's more or less an acceptable price, but about the securitization, I mean, most of these Eastern European, these so-called new member states have more or less this point of view, because the European Union plays a much more geopolitical role than, let's say, in Netherlands or in Spain, because it's perceived in a purely economic way, but there is no tension between this, let's say, dominance of Germany, because, let's say, Germany doesn't function in Latvian public sphere in this sense, and it has never functioned because we have, of course, this kind of post-colonial relationship with Russia, and this dominates the discussion.
Right, and yes, please.
Okay. What I wanted to ask is, like in Latvia, the people who experienced the austerity measures the most were the ones who were on the lower social scale. And combining that with recklessness gets awarded. How can we learn for not letting that to happen in the future? Because we have not talked about...
You can't. Sorry, you can't. That would happen always, because that's the nature of the game. You will always have several or some individuals, parties playing reckless, and others paying for that. That's almost impossible to, but you can survive. If 10% do not pay taxes, it's okay. You can still do things. If 40% do not pay taxes, that's really bad. I mean, you can't function. So in a way, there's always a margin for recklessness. There will always be reckless parties rewarded for their recklessness after the event by the others. Now, the first part of the question was who was more suffering, or what was?
No, I was saying the people who were lower on the social scale suffered the most. Not the people at the top, but the people who were already vulnerable as such. And when the crisis came, it hit them the hardest. So what I want to know is if something like this happens again, whether it can be avoided, and if so, then how?
In my opinion, you should look at this context in the context of the broader perspective of the economic development of these countries, including Latvia, because Latvia also before the crisis, of course, we had, let's say, 4 years of economic boom and of an economic bubble in the real estate sector and so on and so forth, but we were underdeveloped actually from the European perspective also before the crisis, which means that this was just let's say, one of the moves in a broader game.
What was interesting was that before the crisis, the most vulnerable to the poverty risks were those elderly people at the age of pension or pensioners. What has happened as a result of the crisis is that they're now most vulnerable are single parents with children. So there is a change which resulted from the crisis in the segments of population who are now under risk of poverty are different from those who were before.
Now, I'm very, very happy to take any further comments or questions, or indeed any final points from our panelists, but I think we've had an excellent, and to me certainly, very eye-opening and clarifying discussion. And I have to confess, unless anybody wants to contradict me on this, that I come away from it in a spirit of slightly increased pessimism, that in a sense this crisis has not been crisis enough. It has taught us that if you are an ordinary member of the public, then humility and patience are the values that are expected of you. If you are an exceptional member of the public, then you can get angry, but you have to challenge it. But you have to channel it, I'm sorry. It's not even so much, I think, the size of the countries as the size of the liabilities which matter. So, if you're going to fail, then fail very, very, very big. And finally, that the role of moral hazard has emerged entirely intact, that we haven't seen the reckless sufficiently clearly punished, and we're not even sure that they should be in the interests of greater stability.
So how would you propose to make the crisis worse?
The privilege of the moderator.
so that it became more of a learning experience.
For example, Latvians not getting a loan.
Yes, I think we've missed that opportunity, Jim. Right, okay, a big thank you to our panelists for an excellent discussion.
If Latvians didn't get the loan.
Very good.
So that would
And
be really,
we've got a
really bad.
coffee break now, and I would thoroughly like to commend to you the virtues of the film which is coming up after the coffee break, which will be introduced by David Herman. The first part was a joy throughout, and the second part will build on that. So let's get some coffee and come back. Thank you.